guys, welcome to another episode of Smash JT. You know, I've done a few videos on the PlayStation Classic. My original video of why it wouldn't be successful long term because of the pack-ins and what's included with it, or should I say lack thereof. And then a follow-up video talking about the game selection and why it wasn't necessarily ideal. And since those videos have come out, the gaming community at large, for the most part, is in agreement that the titles that they chose are not necessarily representative of what PlayStation stood for back in the day and the classics that should have been included with it. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about this, and I think I came up with the perfect idea of what Sony should have done with the PlayStation Classic to make it as successful as possible. JT. It doesn't have Crash Bandicoot on the PlayStation Classic. And for those of us who remember the days of PlayStation when it was first getting started and the major competition they were having with Nintendo, and if you want to go so far as to say Sega and the Saturn, they would be competing with Mario, with Sonic, with Crash Bandicoot.
Hey, plumber boy, mustache man, your worst nightmare has arrived. Pack up your stuff. I got a little surprise for you here. Check it out. What do you think about that?
They had commercials running, making fun of Nintendo, and basically starting that generation's version of the console wars. And when you harken back to the days of the original PlayStation, when you used to play it when it first came out, Crash Bandicoot is the #1 game that comes to most people's minds. When you think about Sony PlayStation, when you think about a game that sold a lot of copies and a character that defined an entire console, you think Crash Bandicoot. He's not on there. Sony should not release a console calling it a classic and not include the major mascot for it. It feels like the PlayStation Classic sales pitch is trying too hard to carbon copy what Nintendo did with their classic mini launch lineup on the NES and the Super Nintendo. The difference being, Nintendo uses a lot of first-party titles that are system sellers and harken back to the days of nostalgia with when people used to play them to make them want to relive those days once again. That's kind of what the whole point of these classic consoles was as far as Nintendo was concerned. But Sony copied it only up to a certain point, and then they kind of went their own direction when licensing got a little bit too complicated. At least, that's what it feels like. The titles are good. As I stated in my previous videos, they're not terrible games by any stretch of the imagination. Most of these are above average, if not good to very good games. The problem isn't the quality of the games. The problem is, who is the target market for this? It's all over the place. It's not shooting for nostalgia. It's not shooting for a mature audience. It's not shooting for a casual gamer. It's shooting for somewhere in between all of that and hoping to grab at everything they can to sell as many of these and make a quick cash grab as possible. And that kind of approach is not going to be successful for the long term of a console like this. Now, people might hear that and say, what could Sony have done to make this better? They needed to get Crash. Let's be honest. Not having Crash on a Sony classic console is like Nintendo not having Mario. It's like Sega not having Sonic. This is their mascot that defined the Sony PlayStation when it first came out. To not have them on a classic console is just beyond ludicrous to me. I don't care about licensing issues with Activision. If you were not cheap about this, if you are willing to actually pay Activision to get the licenses for Crash, I'm pretty sure they would have been on board with this. It comes down to money, and Sony did not want to spend the money in order to get the games on this console. They went with what looks like the most available licenses from the most available platforms out there, and then threw them all together. The one exception I would look at from this and say, Metal Gear Solid, that one was probably tough to get. Outside of that, they didn't really try too hard here. People might hear this and say, okay, what if Activision wasn't giving the license to Crash Bandicoot? What if Square Enix, for whatever reason, who gave the license for Final Fantasy VII, didn't want to give the license for Tomb Raider? Which, okay, I'll try to go along with that story, but if that's the case, there's a different approach Sony could have taken with this. Instead of copying the cookie cutter formula that Nintendo had, slapping a bunch of games on a system and trying to sell it, is take a completely different approach. And this is something that wouldn't look like a cash grab. This would have their all vested interests from tons of different publishers in on selling this console together. And that is, as crazy as this may sound, selling an empty console with some expandable memory and with one DualShock controller and the ability to buy another DualShock controller if you want to separately, and then have a storefront. Similar to the PlayStation Network store where you can go on your PS3 and PS4 and purchase games for download, why not make a PS1 Classic store and make it exclusive to the PlayStation Classic, allowing people to purchase whichever games they want to from the publishers that are willing to put their games up on the storefront, which based off the PlayStation 3, I would imagine is quite a few publishers would be in on this because there's a monetary financial gain and vested interest for all of them to be a part of it. But Sony didn't want to do that because they're trying to make as much money as possible with this. And instead of future-proofing the console, they were trying to be one and done and slap a bunch of games on this mini console out for the holiday season and hopefully just sell as many as possible. But if they had the PlayStation Classic store where you could connect to the internet with this PlayStation mini console and be able to purchase games specifically for this on the PlayStation 1, it would make everybody happy. You could sell the system for far less money, I'm thinking 60, 70 bucks, with the potential of making far more money in the future from selling these games at 5 to 10 bucks a piece, and people would buy them in droves for it. Now, first off, people might say, no, the Nintendo did it the right way. They had a bunch of games on here, and you can get those for 60 bucks already. Why would I buy the PlayStation 1 and then have to buy the games separately after that? The games on PlayStation 1 are larger in file size, far more complex games, far more complicated with licenses for the most part to get a lot of these on it. So Sony would have been able to sell a lot of the publishers in joining in if they were able to replicate what they did with the PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4 storefronts. That's really as simple as it could have been, and I know a ton of people would have been on board with this thing. Imagine being able to go online and buy Chrono Cross for it, or Legend of Dragoon, or Suikoden 2, or even the original Suikoden. There's so many incredible games on the original PlayStation that are not on the PlayStation Classic that if they gave the ability for people to have the freedom to go online and download what they wanted, could you imagine the response people would have had with this? Now, maybe they could have even included a few games on it, like 5 or 10 games, and allow you to download 10 more that you want to pick on the online store. Just imagine the freedom people would have loved to have with that without the need of hacking the console. Consumers have proven that they want to spend money on games if they are given the avenue to do so. And by Sony not giving people that avenue, people are going to speak with their wallets and say, I don't want these games on that console. Why would I buy that? There are better options out there to do the same thing better than what the PlayStation Classic is able to do. At the end of the day, this thing is turning more into shelf candy than an actual usable console. And not only would having a storefront for the PlayStation 1 Classic be something unique to the mini console market, but it would also future-proof Sony for selling the future consoles of the PS2 Mini, or the PS3 Classic, or eventually the PS4 Classic, where they could just have a storefront for each of these consoles generations and let people download the games that they want to pick from the store. And if they want to import the games that they bought previously on the other classic consoles, they'd be able to do that with backwards compatibility on the online store. It just makes sense, and honestly it's a head scratcher that Sony didn't go this direction, especially when they started digging into finding the licenses and how challenging it would be to get together a bunch of games that they thought gamers would want to have on the classic console. Maybe I'm crazy for saying this. I would love to hear what you guys have to say. Do you feel like that would be a good idea for Sony to go the direction of with a mini console and allowing people the freedom of buying the games they want for it? Or do you like the idea that they already come pre-packaged, it's convenient, people can just buy it, plug it in, and play it without any updates or anything? Let me know in the comments below. I'd be very interested to hear where you guys take this one. That's all I got for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good one.